Hey guys, welcome back to another deep dive into the weird, wonderful, and surprisingly nerdy side of history that your school textbooks absolutely refuse to make interesting. Today, we're kicking off a five-part series about one of the most misunderstood empires in all of human history, and I promise you, by the end of this, you're going to look at the Mongols completely differently than you did before. Because when most people think about the Mongol Empire, they think about horses and arrows and burning cities and Genghis Khan doing Genghis Khan things. And yeah, sure, all of that happened. But what almost nobody talks about, what gets buried underneath all the dramatic conquest narratives and the terrifying reputation, is the absolutely staggering amount of technological exchange, scientific advancement, and genuine discovery that happened because of, during, and sometimes in spite of the Mongol Empire. So buckle up, because we're about to talk about Boring History China, Mongol Edition, and trust me when I say it's anything but boring. Let's start with the basics. Because if we're going to understand why the Mongol Empire became one of the most important engines of technological transfer in human history, we need to understand what China looked like technologically before the Mongols showed up and rearranged the furniture. And by rearrange the furniture, I mean knocked down the walls, burned the house, and then rebuilt it in a way that somehow connected it to every other house on the continent. China, in the 12th and early 13th centuries, was, without exaggeration, the most technologically advanced civilization on the planet. The Song Dynasty, which ruled southern China even as the Yuan Dynasty controlled the north, had achieved things that Europe wouldn't figure out for another 300 to 500 years. We're talking about movable type printing, advanced metallurgy, sophisticated naval technology, gunpowder weapons that were actually being used in warfare, and not just for fireworks, paper money that functioned as a real economic instrument, hydraulic engineering that would make a modern civil engineer raise an eyebrow in respect, and agricultural techniques that supported a population that dwarfed anything Europe could manage at the time. And this is the part where most people's brains just sort of glaze over, because we've all heard the China invented gunpowder and paper and the compass speech a million times. And it's become one of those facts that sits in your brain without any real weight behind it. You know it the same way you know that water is wet. It's just a thing. But here's what makes it actually interesting in the context of the Mongol Empire. All of that technology was essentially locked inside China. The Silk Road existed, sure, and there was trade happening, and knowledge did trickle westward in dribs and drabs over the centuries. But the sheer volume and sophistication of Chinese technological achievement was largely contained within Chinese borders, shared with immediate neighbors to varying degrees, but fundamentally staying put. The Mongol Empire changed that, not because they were brilliant scientists or dedicated patrons of learning, at least not initially, but because they did something that nobody had ever done before at that scale. They connected everything. They built the largest contiguous land empire in human history, stretching from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to Southeast Asia, and in doing so, they created a network, a messy, violent, often chaotic network, but a network nonetheless, through which ideas and technologies and skilled people could flow in ways that had simply never been possible before. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's rewind. The story of Mongol technological engagement really begins with siege warfare, because this is where the Mongols first encountered a problem they couldn't solve with cavalry tactics and superior mobility. When Genghis Khan began his campaigns against the Yuan Dynasty in northern China around 1211, his armies were devastating in open battle. The Mongol cavalry was faster, more disciplined, more adaptable, and more ruthlessly efficient than anything the Jin could field. But cities were a different story. Cities had walls, big walls, walls that horses couldn't jump over and arrows couldn't punch through, and the Mongols, being a nomadic people who had never really needed to deal with fortifications before, initially had no idea what to do about them. Now, this is where the first really interesting technological story begins, because the Mongols did something that would become one of their defining characteristics. They learned. They didn't sit outside the walls feeling frustrated and eventually go home. They didn't bash their heads against the problem using the same approach over and over. They adapted, and they adapted fast. And the way they adapted tells you everything you need to know about how the Mongol Empire would eventually become the greatest technology transfer mechanism of the medieval world. The first thing they did was recruit. When the Mongols captured cities and territories, they didn't just kill everyone. Well, sometimes they did, but strategically they identified useful people. Engineers, artisans, doctors, scholars, anyone with technical skills was separated from the general population and pressed into service. This wasn't a gentle process. Let's not romanticize it. These were conquered people being forced to work for their conquerors. But the effect was profound. Within just a few years of beginning their campaigns in China, the Mongols had assembled teams of Chinese engineers who could build and operate siege equipment, trebuchets, as battering rams, siege towers, and most importantly, early gunpowder weapons. And this is where we need to talk about gunpowder in a way that goes beyond the usual China invented gunpowder factoid, because the state of gunpowder technology in early 13th century China was far more advanced and far more diverse than most people realize. By the time the Mongols arrived on the scene, Chinese armies were using fire arrows enhanced with gunpowder, fire lances that were essentially early flamethrowers mounted on spears, explosive bombs called thunderclap bombs that were launched from catapults, smoke screens generated by specialized gunpowder mixtures, and something called a fire ox, which was basically an incendiary weapon designed to create chaos in enemy formations. The Yuan Dynasty, in particular, had developed sophisticated gunpowder weapons specifically because they needed them. The Jin were Jurchen people who had conquered northern China from the Song Dynasty, and they faced threats from multiple directions, including, eventually, the Mongols. Their military engineers had been refining gunpowder weaponry for decades, and when the Mongols started hammering at their gates, the Jin deployed these weapons with devastating effectiveness. There are accounts from the siege of Kaifeng in 1232 and 1233 that describe the Jin defenders using weapons that sound almost modern in their destructive capability. They used something called a heaven-shaking thunder bomb, which was an iron-cased explosive device that produced massive blasts and sent shrapnel flying in all directions. They used fire lances that sprayed flames and projectiles at close range. They even had what some historians believe were early rockets, though the exact nature of these weapons is still debated. The Mongols to their credit and to the terror of everyone else on the planet, took notes. When they eventually captured Jin territory and the engineers who had built these weapons, that knowledge didn't disappear. It got absorbed into the Mongol military machine, refined, scaled up, and then carried westward as the empire expanded. This is one of the most important and most overlooked stories in the history of technology. The Mongol campaigns against China didn't just encounter gunpowder weapons, they captured the entire knowledge base that had produced those weapons, including the chemical expertise to manufacture different gunpowder formulations, the metallurgical skills to create iron casings and projectile housings, and the engineering know-how to design delivery systems. But siege warfare was only the beginning. As the Mongol Empire solidified its control over northern China and eventually conquered the Song Dynasty in the south, something remarkable started happening. The Mongols, who had started as technological borrowers, began to function as technological brokers. They were sitting on top of the most advanced civilization in the world, and they were simultaneously connected to Central Asia, Persia, the Middle East, Russia, and Eastern Europe. They had the political authority, the logistical networks, and crucially, the motivation to move ideas, techniques, and skilled people across these vast distances. And let me tell you about the motivation part, because this is something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. The Mongols were empire builders, and empires run on administration. You can conquer territory with cavalry and arrows, but you can't govern it that way. You need census data to know how many people you're ruling. You need tax records to collect revenue. You need communication systems to transmit orders across thousands of miles. You need roads and post stations and translators and scribes and accountants and cartographers and all the boring administrative infrastructure that actually makes an empire function. And the Mongols, starting from a baseline of nomadic pastoralism with no written language of their own, until Genghis Khan commissioned one, had needed all of this desperately. So they took it from everywhere. They adopted the Uyghur script and adapted it for the Mongolian language. They recruited Chinese administrators to run their census and to tax systems. They brought in Persian and Central Asian officials to manage trade and diplomacy. They employed Arab and Chinese astronomers to build observatories. They used Chinese printing technology to produce administrative documents and eventually paper money for the entire empire. They adopted and refined the Chinese postal system, the YAM, into one of the most impressive communication networks the medieval world had ever seen, with relay stations every 25 to 30 miles across the entire empire, stocked with fresh horses, supplies, and personnel. This postal system alone deserves way more attention than it gets, because it wasn't just about carrying messages. The YAM system was the backbone of Mongol imperial administration, and it facilitated the movement of not just information, but people, goods, and ideas across the entire length of Asia. A merchant or diplomat or engineer traveling under Mongol protection could move from Beijing to Baghdad along a network of supported routes with relative safety, a journey that would have been almost unimaginably dangerous and difficult before the Mongol conquests. Marco Polo, the most famous European traveler of the era, used this system, and his descriptions of it were so detailed and so astonishing to his European readers that many of them simply didn't believe him. But here's where China specifically comes back into the story in a big way. Because the technologies that the Mongols were pulling out of China and distributing across their empire weren't just military technologies. The Song Dynasty had developed innovations in virtually every field of human endeavor, and the Mongol conquest of Song China in the 1270s opened up a treasure chest of knowledge that would reshape the world. Let's talk about printing, because this one is really important and really underappreciated. China had been using woodblock printing since at least the 7th century, and movable type printing using individual characters that could be rearranged and reused had been invented by Bi Sheng during the Song Dynasty around 1040. That's roughly 400 years before Gutenberg. Now, movable type in China never achieved quite the same revolutionary impact that it did in Europe. It's partly because the Chinese writing system uses thousands of characters rather than a small alphabet, making the logistics of movable type much more complicated. But the underlying technology, the concept, and the engineering was there, and the Mongols recognized its administrative utility immediately. Under Mongol rule, printing expanded dramatically, not just in Chinese but in multiple languages and scripts. The Yuan Dynasty, which was the Mongol rule dynasty in China, established by Kublai Khan, produced printed documents in Chinese, Mongolian, Persian, Arabic, and other languages. They printed paper money on an unprecedented scale, essentially running the world's first experiment in fiat currency, backed by government authority rather than precious metal. They printed administrative manuals, legal codes, agricultural handbooks, and calendars. They printed Buddhist and Taoist and Confucian texts because the Mongols, whatever else you might say about them, were remarkably tolerant of different religions and recognized that keeping religious institutions happy was good governance. And the printing technology didn't stay in China. There's evidence that knowledge of printing techniques traveled westward along Mongol trade and communication routes, reaching Central Asia and Persia. Whether this knowledge directly influenced the development of printing in Europe is one of those historical questions that scholars love to argue about, and we'll get into that debate more in later parts of this series. But the simple fact that printing technology was being actively used and disseminated across the largest empire on Earth, centuries before Europe figured it out independently, is one of those facts that should reshape how you think about the history of technology. Now, let's pivot to something that might seem mundane, but is actually one of the most important technological stories of this entire period: paper money. I mentioned it briefly, but it deserves its own discussion because what the Mongols did with paper money was genuinely unprecedented and had consequences that rippled through economic history for centuries. The concept of paper money originated in China during the Tang Dynasty around the 7th century as a practical solution to the problem of carrying heavy copper coins over long distances. By the Song Dynasty, it had evolved into a sophisticated financial instrument with government-issued notes backed by reserves of silk, precious metals, or other commodities. When the Mongols conquered China, they inherited this system, and under Kublai Khan, they took it to an entirely new level. The Yuan Dynasty issued paper currency called Chao, and they didn't just use it as a supplement to coin currency. They made it the dominant medium of exchange across the entire empire. This was an extraordinary experiment in monetary policy, and it worked remarkably well for several decades. Marco Polo was absolutely flabbergasted by it. He devoted extensive passages in his account to describing how the Great Khan could essentially create wealth by printing pieces of paper, how these pieces of paper were accepted throughout the empire as readily as gold or silver, and how anyone who refused to accept them would face severe punishment. Polo called it a form of alchemy, and you can almost hear the incredulity in his writing. The system worked because the Mongol government enforced acceptance, maintained relatively disciplined issuance, at least initially, and backed the currency with the full authority of the largest empire on earth. It failed eventually, as paper money systems often do, when governments succumb to the temptation to print too much, and the inflation that resulted was one of several factors that contributed to the decline of the Yuan dynasty. But the experiment itself was a landmark in economic history, and knowledge of it, carried westward by merchants and travelers, planted seeds that would eventually influence European thinking about money, credit, and financial instruments. We're just scratching the surface here, and already the scope of what the Mongol Empire meant for technology and discovery is becoming clear. This wasn't just a story of conquest and destruction, though there was plenty of both. It was a story of connection, of networks, of the forced and sometimes voluntary movement of knowledge across distances that had previously been almost insurmountable barriers. The Mongols didn't invent most of the technologies we've been discussing. They didn't need to. What they did was arguably more impactful. They created the conditions under which those technologies could spread, combat, and evolve in ways that reshape the world. In the next part, we're going to dig deeper into specific technologies that traveled along Mongol networks, including the really juicy stuff about gunpowder's journey westward, the astronomical observations that connected Chinese and Islamic science, and the medical knowledge that crossed cultural boundaries under Mongol patronage. We're also going to talk about some of the darker aspects of this technological transfer, because not everything about the Mongol approach to knowledge acquisition was admirable, and understanding the full picture means grappling with the complexity of an empire that was simultaneously one of history's greatest destroyers and one of its greatest connectors. Stay tuned for Part 2. It's going to get nerdy. Hashtag the Mongol Empire, Technology and Discoveries. Part 2. Gunpowder, Star Charts, and the Medicine of Empires. All right, let's get nerdy. As we ended Part 1 by talking about the Mongol Empire as a vast connective tissue linking civilizations that had previously interacted only through long chains of intermediaries. Now, we need to get into the specifics, because the devil really is in the details when it comes to technological transfer, and the details of how individual technologies moved across the Mongol world are often far more complicated, far more interesting, and far more morally ambiguous than the simplified version you usually hear. Let's start with the big one, the one everybody wants to talk about: gunpowder. The long, strange journey of gunpowder. Here's the version of the story you probably learned. China invented gunpowder. The Mongols picked it up, brought it west, and Europeans eventually used it to develop firearms that changed warfare forever. That version isn't exactly wrong, but it's so compressed and simplified that it misses almost everything that makes the actual history interesting. First, let's talk about what gunpowder actually was in China before the Mongols showed up, because it wasn't what you're imagining. By the time of the Song Dynasty, which the Mongols were busy conquering through much of the 13th century, Chinese engineers had developed an extraordinary range of gunpowder weapons, but most of them would look strange to modern eyes. We're talking about fire arrows, which were basically rockets strapped to arrow shafts. We're talking about fire lances, which were essentially flamethrowers made from bamboo tubes that spewed flame and shrapnel at close range. We're talking about thunder crash bombs, which were ceramic or metal shells packed with gunpowder and iron fragments designed to be hurled by catapults or dropped from city walls. We're talking about something called a bee swarm rocket launcher, which fired clusters of small rockets simultaneously. What we're mostly not talking about, at least not in the early 13th century, is guns. Not yet. The earliest surviving gun, a small bronze hand cannon found in Manchuria, dates to roughly 1288, and the technology of metal-barreled firearms was still evolving during the period of Mongol conquest. This matters because it means the gunpowder technology that initially spread westward through Mongol networks wasn't firearms technology in the way we usually think about it. It was a much more diverse and in some ways more creative toolkit of incendiary and explosive weapons. Now, how did this technology actually move? This is where things get complicated because there wasn't a single moment of transfer. There were multiple pathways, multiple time frames, and multiple mechanisms. The most direct mechanism was battlefield contact. When the Mongols besieged and conquered Song Chinese cities, they encountered gunpowder weapons used against them, and they were not stupid people. They learned. They captured engineers. They incorporated these weapons into their own arsenal, and then they carried those weapons and those engineers westward as they expanded their empire. When Mongol armies showed up in Central Asia, in Persia, in Eastern Europe, they brought gunpowder weapons with them, and the people on the receiving end of those weapons took very careful note. But battlefield contact was only part of the story. There was also deliberate knowledge transfer through the administrative networks of the empire. The Mongols moved experts around like chess pieces. Chinese engineers ended up working in Persia. Persian siege specialists ended up in China. These people didn't just bring their individual skills, they brought entire knowledge traditions. And when those traditions collided, new innovations emerged. A perfect example of this is what happened with siege warfare. The Mongols famously struggled with the heavily fortified cities of the Song Dynasty, which had some of the most sophisticated urban defenses in the medieval world. In response, they recruited siege engineers from across their empire. During the siege of Xiangyang, which lasted from 1267 to 1273, and was one of the pivotal engagements in the Mongol conquest of the Song, the Mongols brought in two Muslim engineers, Ismail and Ali al-Din, who designed counterweight trebuchets far more powerful than anything the Chinese had previously encountered. These were based on Islamic engineering traditions that had themselves been influenced by earlier contact with Chinese and Byzantine technology. So you had Islamic siege technology being used to breach Chinese walls, deployed by Mongol commanders, in a conflict that would ultimately lead to the capture of Chinese gunpowder technology that would then flow back westward through those same Islamic networks. If your head is spinning, good. That means you're starting to grasp how tangled and nonlinear this process actually was. The Western journey of gunpowder knowledge happened gradually through the late 13th and early 14th centuries. Arabic texts from this period begin describing gunpowder compositions and weapons, sometimes using terms that are clearly derived from Chinese originals. A manuscript by Hassan al-Rama, written around 1270 to 1280, contains recipes for gunpowder and descriptions of rockets, fire lances, and explosive devices that show clear Chinese influence. The Arabic term for saltpeter, Chinese snow, is itself a linguistic fossil, preserving the memory of where this knowledge came from. From the Islamic world, gunpowder knowledge continued its westward migration into Europe, where the earliest references appear in the late 13th century. Roger Bacon's mention of gunpowder around 1267, the Liber Ignium attributed to Marcus Gracchus, at the first European depictions of cannon in the 1320s, these are all waypoints in a journey that took roughly a century and covered thousands of miles. But here's what makes this story truly interesting from a technological perspective. Gunpowder didn't just move unchanged from east to west. It evolved at every stage of its journey. Each culture that encountered it brought its own engineering traditions, its own materials, its own military needs, and its own creative adaptations. The gunpowder weapons that eventually emerged in Europe were not copies of Chinese originals. They were the product of a long chain of cultural translation and innovation, each link adding something new. European metallurgy, for instance, was in some ways more advanced than Chinese metallurgy when it came to casting large metal objects. And this turned out to be crucial for developing the heavy cannon that would eventually transform European warfare. The Europeans didn't just receive gunpowder, they married it to their own existing technological strengths and created something new. This is the real lesson of the Mongol role in gunpowder's history. The Mongols didn't simply carry a finished product from one place to another. They created the conditions, the political stability, the trade routes, the forced migration of experts, the cross-cultural contact that allowed a technology to undergo a process of iterative transformation as it moved through multiple civilizations. The end product was something no single culture could have created alone. At Stars Across Borders, Astronomy under the Mongols. Now, let's talk about something that doesn't get nearly enough attention. What happened to astronomy under Mongol rule? Because this is one of the most remarkable stories of scientific collaboration in pre-modern history, and almost nobody outside of specialist academic circles knows about it. The Mongols themselves were not astronomers, but they had deep practical reasons to care about astronomy. Mongol culture placed enormous importance on divination and astrology. The selection of auspicious dates for military campaigns, coronations, and other important events was a serious matter of state policy. This meant that whoever could provide the most accurate astronomical predictions had real political power at the Mongol court. And this created a competitive marketplace of astronomical traditions. At the court of Kublai Khan in China, you had Chinese astronomers working alongside Muslim astronomers, alongside Tibetan astronomers, each using their own methods, their own instruments, and their own theoretical frameworks. And Kublai, in a move that was simultaneously pragmatic and intellectually daring, essentially let them compete. He wanted the best predictions, and he didn't particularly care which tradition produced them. The institutional expression of this was remarkable. Kublai Khan established two parallel astronomical bureaus in his capital. One was staffed by Chinese astronomers working in the traditional Chinese astronomical tradition. The other was staffed by Muslim astronomers, primarily from the Persian and Central Asian traditions, set working with Islamic astronomical methods. The two bureaus operated independently, but were clearly aware of each other's work, and the cross-pollination between them was significant. The Muslim Astronomical Bureau, known as the Hui Sitian, was led by Jamal al-Din, a Persian astronomer who arrived at Kublai's court around 1267. He brought with him a set of astronomical instruments and astronomical tables based on the Islamic tradition, which had itself incorporated and refined earlier Greek astronomical knowledge. He also presented Kublai Khan with a terrestrial globe and a set of astronomical instruments that were unlike anything the Chinese court had previously seen. Meanwhile, the Chinese bureau was led by Guo Shoujing, one of the most brilliant astronomers and engineers in Chinese history, on a figure who deserves to be far more famous than he is. Guo Shoujing designed and built a series of astronomical instruments of extraordinary precision, including a massive gnomon 40 feet tall that could measure the shadow of the sun with unprecedented accuracy. He established a network of 27 observation stations across the Mongol Empire, stretching from Siberia to the South China Sea, conducting simultaneous observations at multiple latitudes. This was, in terms of geographic scope, the largest coordinated astronomical observation program the world had ever seen. The result of Guo Shoujing's work was the Shoshi calendar, completed in 1281, which calculated the length of the tropical year as 365.2425 days. If that number looks familiar, it should. It's the same value used in the Gregorian calendar, which wouldn't be adopted in Europe until 1582. 3 centuries later. Guo Shoujing's calculation was accurate to within about 26 seconds per year. Now, here's what makes this relevant to our story about Mongol technology transfer. Guo Shoujing was clearly aware of Islamic astronomical methods, and there is evidence that his work was influenced by them. Some of his instruments show design features that parallel Islamic instruments. His mathematical techniques for interpolation bear resemblances to methods used in Islamic astronomical tables. The exact degree of Islamic influence on Guo Shoujing's work is debated among historians. But the fact that he was working in an environment where Islamic astronomical knowledge was readily available and actively practiced makes some degree of cross-fertilization almost inevitable. The influence went both directions. Islamic astronomers working in the Mongol world also encountered Chinese astronomical data and methods. The Great Observatory at Moraga, built by Nasser al-Din al-Tusi under the patronage of Hulagu Khan in what is now northwestern Iran, was another site of cross-cultural astronomical exchange. Tusi and his colleagues had access to Chinese astronomical observations and possibly Chinese computational techniques. Some historians have argued that certain mathematical innovations developed at the Moraga Observatory, particularly the Tusi couple, a geometric device for converting circular motion into linear motion, may have eventually influenced Copernicus, though the transmission pathway for this is still debated and far from proven. What is clear is that the Mongol Empire created an unprecedented environment for astronomical exchange. For a brief window of time, the astronomical traditions of China, the Islamic world, and even India were in direct contact, sharing data, comparing methods, and stimulating each other's development. This didn't last. As the Mongol Empire fragmented, these connections attenuated and eventually broke. But the scientific legacy of this period of contact continued to influence astronomical practice in both China and the Islamic world for centuries afterward. Medicine, without borders, but with plenty of complications. The story of medical knowledge under the Mongol Empire is perhaps the most complex of all, because medicine is deeply embedded in cultural and religious frameworks in ways that make cross-cultural transfer particularly fraught. Every civilization within the Mongol sphere had its own sophisticated medical tradition. Chinese medicine, with its emphasis on pulse diagnosis, herbal pharmacology, and theories of qi and yin-yang balance. Islamic medicine, heir to the Greek Galenic tradition, but with centuries of original development, particularly in pharmacology and surgical technique. Tibetan medicine, which blended Indian Ayurvedic traditions with indigenous practices. Uyghur medical traditions. Each of these was a complete system, internally coherent, with its own theoretical foundations, its own diagnostic methods, its own therapeutic approaches. The Mongols, characteristically, took a pragmatic approach. They used whatever worked, or whatever they believed worked, drawing from multiple traditions simultaneously. Mongol rulers routinely consulted physicians from different traditions, sometimes for the same illness. Rashid al-Din, the Persian historian who served as vizier to the Ilkhanate, compiled a remarkable text called the Tanksuknama, which was essentially a translation and adaptation of Chinese medical knowledge for a Persian-speaking audience. This text included information on Chinese pulse diagnosis, Chinese pharmaceutical preparations, and Chinese anatomical concepts, presented alongside comparative notes relating them to Islamic medical theory. This was genuinely groundbreaking. Before the Mongol period, there had been limited contact between Chinese and Islamic medical traditions. The Tanksuknama represented one of the first serious attempts to systematically translate Chinese medical knowledge into the conceptual framework of another culture. It wasn't always successful. Some Chinese concepts simply didn't map neatly onto Islamic medical categories. But the attempt itself was remarkable. In the other direction, Islamic medical knowledge flowed into China through the same Mongol networks. The Yuan Dynasty saw the establishment of Muslim medical institutions in China, and Islamic pharmaceutical knowledge in particular found receptive audiences. The Hui Hui Yaofeng, a pharmacological text compiled during the Yuan Dynasty, contained recipes and preparations drawn from the Islamic medical tradition, translated and adapted for Chinese use. Many of these preparations involved medicinal substances that were not native to China, but were available through Mongol trade networks, things like frankincense, myrrh, and various aromatic resins from the Middle East and East Africa. But we need to be honest about the limitations of this medical exchange because the reality was messier and less triumphant than a simple narrative of knowledge sharing would suggest. Much of the medical knowledge that crossed cultural boundaries under Mongol rule was pharmacological rather than theoretical. It was easier to adopt a new drug or a new preparation technique than to adopt an entirely different theoretical framework for understanding disease. Chinese physicians might use Islamic medicines without accepting the Galenic humoral theory that explained why those medicines were supposed to work. Islamic physicians might adopt Chinese diagnostic techniques without accepting the theory of qi that underpinned them. The result was often a superficial borrowing of practices stripped from their theoretical context, which could limit their effectiveness and certainly limited their transformative potential. There was also the darker side of medical knowledge under the Mongols, which brings us to a topic we promised to address: the less admirable aspects of Mongol technology acquisition, the dark side of knowledge transfer. Not all Mongol knowledge acquisition was peaceful trade and scholarly exchange. A significant amount of it was accomplished through conquest, coercion, and the forced relocation of skilled populations. The Mongol practice of sparing and relocating artisans and specialists during conquests was, from one perspective, a rational policy that preserved valuable human capital. From the perspective of the people being relocated, it was something quite different. These were individuals and families torn from their homes, their communities, their cultural contexts, and transported sometimes thousands of miles to serve the needs of their conquerors. Chinese engineers sent to work in Persia. Persian astronomers dispatched to China. Central Asian craftsmen relocated to Mongolia. These were forced migrations, and calling them knowledge transfer without acknowledging the human cost is dishonest. The scale of this forced relocation was enormous. After the conquest of Samarkand and other Central Asian cities, tens of thousands of artisans were reportedly sorted, cataloged by skill, and distributed across the empire like inventory. And these included metal workers, textile workers, siege engineers, architects, and physicians. Their skills were valued, which meant they were treated better than the general population. But being a valued captive is still being a captive. This complicates the narrative of the Mongol Empire as a facilitator of knowledge exchange. Yes, it created unprecedented connections between civilizations. Yes, it enabled technologies and ideas to cross boundaries that had previously been nearly impermeable. But it did so in significant part through violence and coercion. The great cross-cultural collaborations we've been discussing, the astronomical bureaus, the medical translations, the gunpowder evolution, were made possible by an empire that had first devastated the very civilizations whose knowledge it was now combining. This is the paradox at the heart of the Mongol technological story, and it's a paradox we need to sit with rather than resolved too neatly. The same empire that destroyed Baghdad, one of the greatest centers of learning in the medieval world, also created the conditions for new forms of knowledge creation. The same rulers who ordered the massacre of entire city populations also patronized astronomers, physicians, and engineers. These are not contradictions that cancel each other out. They are both true simultaneously, and understanding the full picture of Mongol technology and discovery requires holding both truths in mind at once. In Part 3, we're going to shift our focus to some of the specific material technologies that the Mongols either developed or transformed their approaches to metallurgy, textile production, printing, and communication systems. We're also going to talk about the YAM, the Mongol postal system, which was arguably one of the most impressive logistical achievements of the pre-modern world and which made much of the knowledge transfer we've been discussing physically possible. Because ideas don't travel by themselves. They travel through networks, and the Mongols built networks like nobody before or since. Hashtag Part 3, the networks and the things they carried. Let's start with the YAM, because without it, almost nothing else we're going to talk about would have been possible. And because the YAM is one of those things that sounds simple when you describe it in a sentence, the Mongols had a postal system, but becomes genuinely staggering when you start looking at the details. The basic concept was relay stations. You place stations at regular intervals across the empire, stock them with fresh horses and supplies and personnel, and a rider carrying a message can swap mounts at each station and keep moving without stopping. The message travels at the speed of a galloping horse, sustained across distances that no single horse could ever cover. Simple, right? The Chinese had done versions of this. The Persians had done versions of this. The Romans had done versions of this. What the Mongols did was different in scale and in ambition. At its peak, the YAM system stretched from the Pacific coast of China to the borders of Hungary. We're talking about something like 10,000 kilometers of maintained routes, with stations spaced roughly every 25 to 35 miles. Each station maintained a stable of horses. Marco Polo, who actually used the system and was not, for once, obviously exaggerating, claimed some major stations kept as many as 400 horses ready at any given time. More typical stations probably maintained between 15 and 25. But the total number of horses in the system at any point was almost certainly in the hundreds of thousands. Some estimates put it at over 300,000. Let that number sit for a moment. 300,000 horses, maintained and fed and housed and rotated across the largest contiguous land empire in human history, just so that messages could move fast. The logistical overhead of this system was enormous, and the Mongols maintained it anyway because they understood something fundamental. An empire that cannot communicate with itself is not really an empire. It's just a collection of places that happen to have the same ruler. The stations weren't just horse depots either. They provided food and shelter for riders and for authorized travelers. They maintained supplies of equipment. In areas with rivers, they kept boats. In mountainous terrain, they provided guides. In winter conditions, some stations offered dog sleds. The whole system was adapted to local geography and climate, while maintaining a consistent operational standard across its entire length. Riders in the Yam system could cover something like 200 to 300 kilometers per day under normal conditions. When carrying urgent military dispatches, there are records suggesting speeds of up to 400 kilometers per day, with riders essentially running their relay in shifts around the clock. A message could travel from Karakoram to the Chinese coast in a matter of days. Communication between Beijing and Tabriz, opposite ends of the empire, could be accomplished in a few weeks. In an era when a merchant caravan might take a year to cover the same distance, this was extraordinary. But the Yam was more than a postal system. It was the nervous system of the empire. Tax records, census data, military orders, diplomatic correspondence, intelligence reports, all of it flowed through the Yam. And importantly, so did people. Authorized travelers, which included diplomats, merchants with the right credentials, religious figures, and technical specialists, being relocated to wherever the empire needed them, could use the Yam stations as a network of government-sponsored rest stops. This made long-distance travel across Central Asia dramatically safer and more efficient than it had ever been before, or than it would be again for centuries after the empire's collapse. The paisa, or tablet of authority, was the key that unlocked the system. These were metal tablets, iron, silver, or gold, depending on the bearer's rank and the urgency of their mission, that identified the carrier as someone authorized to use the Yam. Presenting a paisa at a relay station meant you got fresh horses, food, shelter, and an escort to the next station if needed. Interfering with a paisa bearer was an extremely serious crime. The system ran on a combination of infrastructure and authority, and both had to function simultaneously for any of it to work. Now, here's where the Yam connects to our larger story about technology and discovery. The system didn't just carry messages, it carried knowledge. When the Mongols relocated a Persian astronomer to Beijing, that astronomer traveled along the Yam routes. When Chinese medical texts were being brought to scholars in Tabriz, they moved through Yam channels. When a European envoy like William of Rubruck traveled to the Mongol court and then returned to write about what he'd seen, he used the Yam infrastructure. The system was the physical substrate on which the Mongol knowledge economy operated. Without it, the transfer of ideas and technologies across Eurasia would have been slower, more dangerous, more sporadic, and much less systematic. Let's talk about metallurgy now, because this is an area where the Mongols' role as technological conduit gets very concrete and very interesting. The Mongols themselves were competent metalworkers before the conquests began. Steppe peoples had long traditions of working iron and bronze, particularly for weapons, horse gear, and personal ornaments. But Mongol metalworking was practical and functional rather than sophisticated. They made good arrowheads. They made serviceable blades. They were not producing Damascus steel or Chinese cast iron. What changed under the empire was that metallurgical knowledge from multiple advanced traditions got thrown into contact with each other. Chinese ironworking, which had been centuries ahead of European and Middle Eastern practice in certain respects, particularly in the production of cast iron and the development of blast furnace technology, suddenly became accessible to Persian and Central Asian smiths. Persian and Syrian traditions of crucible steel production, which produced the famous watered steel blades that Europeans called Damascus steel, became accessible to Chinese metalworkers. The Mongols didn't necessarily understand the chemistry of what was happening, but they understood that different people knew how to make different things, and that bringing those people together could produce results that neither tradition could achieve alone. We see evidence of this cross-pollination in the archaeological record. Metalwork from the later Mongol period shows hybrid techniques. Chinese casting methods applied to forms and decorative styles from the Islamic world, Middle Eastern steel folding techniques appearing in Chinese weapons. The Mongol military, which was voracious in its appetite for arms and armor, drove much of this exchange. As when you need to equip armies across an empire that stretches from Korea to Poland, you use every metallurgical trick available to you, regardless of where it originated. One specific area where this mattered enormously was in the production of firearms. We discussed gunpowder briefly in earlier parts, but it's worth returning to here because the metallurgical dimension of gunpowder weapons is just as important as the chemical dimension. Making gunpowder is one challenge. Making a tube that can contain a gunpowder explosion and direct it usefully, that is, making a gun barrel, is an entirely different challenge, and it's fundamentally a metallurgical one. The barrel has to be strong enough not to explode, uniform enough to direct the projectile accurately, and durable enough to survive repeated firing. This requires high-quality metal and advanced techniques for shaping it. The Chinese developed the earliest gun barrels using bronze casting, a technology at which they were already extremely accomplished. The oldest confirmed gun, dating to about 1288, is a bronze hand cannon found in Manchuria, territory that was, at that time, under Mongol control. As firearms technology moved westward along Mongol trade and communication routes, it encountered Middle Eastern and European metalworking traditions that had their own strengths, particularly in wrought iron and eventually in the development of iron gun barrels. The cross-fertilization of Chinese casting expertise and Western forging expertise, facilitated by the Mongol network, has contributed to the rapid evolution of firearms technology in the 14th century that would eventually transform global warfare. Textile production is another area where the Mongols played a transformative role, though this might seem surprising given the popular image of the Mongols as rough nomads in animal skins. In reality, the Mongol elite developed an intense appreciation for fine textiles very quickly after the conquest began, and they invested heavily in textile production across the empire. The Mongols encountered three major textile traditions: Chinese silk weaving, which was the most technically advanced in the world, Central Asian and Persian traditions of cotton and wool production, including the famous Nasij cloth of gold, and the various wool and linen traditions of Eastern Europe and the Middle East. Under Mongol patronage, these traditions didn't just coexist, they actively influenced each other. The most visible product of this exchange was a textile type called Nasiai, or cloth of gold, which became practically an obsession of the Mongol court. Nasij involved weaving gold thread into silk fabric to create elaborate, shimmering designs. The technique had pre-Mongol origins in Central Asia, but under the Mongol Empire, it was developed to extraordinary levels of refinement. Workshops producing Nasij were established across the empire, and we can trace in the designs and techniques of these workshops the mingling of Chinese, Persian, and Central Asian aesthetic and technical traditions. The Mongols established what were essentially state-run textile factories in several locations, and to staffing them with skilled weavers gathered from conquered territories. These were not small operations. Some of them employed thousands of workers and produced textiles in industrial quantities for the court and for diplomatic gift-giving, which was a major tool of Mongol statecraft. A bolt of cloth of gold wasn't just a pretty thing, it was a political statement, a demonstration of wealth and power and the ability to command the labor of skilled artisans from multiple civilizations. What's technically interesting about these workshops is that they brought weavers from different traditions into close physical proximity working on shared projects. A Chinese silk weaver and a Persian gold thread specialist and a Central Asian pattern designer might all be contributing to the same textile. The result was technological transfer at the most granular level. Individual craftspeople learning techniques from each other, day by day at the loom. This had lasting effects. Chinese silk weaving technology, which had been closely guarded for centuries, spread more widely across Central and Western Asia during the Mongol period than it had during any previous era. Some scholars argue that the Mongol period represents the final and decisive stage in the diffusion of advanced silk weaving technology from China to the Islamic world, and eventually to Europe. Printing is another area where the Mongol impact was significant and somewhat underappreciated. China had, of course, invented both woodblock printing and movable type centuries before the Mongol conquests. The technology was mature and widely used in China for everything from religious texts to paper money. The Mongols recognized the utility of printing immediately, but particularly for currency production, and they used Chinese printing technology extensively throughout the empire. The most notable application was paper money. The Mongol Yuan Dynasty in China inherited the Chinese tradition of paper currency and expanded it dramatically. Under Kublai Khan, paper money became the primary medium of exchange across the entire Yuan realm, backed by the authority of the state rather than by precious metal reserves. This was, for its time, a radical monetary experiment. It worked, more or less, for several decades before the predictable temptation of overprinting led to inflation and eventual monetary crisis. But the significance for our purposes is that the Mongols didn't just use paper money in China. They attempted to introduce it across the empire, including in Persia, where the Ilkhan Gekatu issued paper currency in 1294 in a direct imitation of the Chinese system. The experiment was a spectacular failure. The Persian economy was not structured in ways that could support paper currency, and the population simply refused to accept it. But the attempt itself tells us something important about how actively the Mongols tried to transfer technologies across their empire. They weren't just passively allowing knowledge to flow. They were actively picking up technologies in one part of their realm and trying to implement them in another. The printing technology behind the currency was also spreading. We see woodblock printing techniques appearing in Middle Eastern and Central Asian contexts during the Mongol period in ways that suggest direct Chinese influence. There's a body of Arabic block-printed material from the 13th and 14th centuries, amulets, prayer texts, playing cards, that shows clear connections to Chinese printing methods. The question of whether this contributed to the eventual development of printing in Europe is one of those historical debates that generates more heat than light, with passionate advocates on both sides. What's clear is that the Mongol period saw Chinese printing technology become more widely known across Eurasia than it had ever been before. And this brings us back to a theme that has run through this entire discussion: the Mongol Empire as a network. Not a network in the metaphorical sense that historians sometimes use the word, but a physical, maintained, staffed, funded network of routes and stations and authorized travelers and relocated specialists and state-sponsored workshops. The Yam was the backbone of this network, but the network extended beyond the Yam to include trade routes, diplomatic missions, military supply chains, and the forced and voluntary migration of millions of people. Technologies move through this network not as abstract ideas floating through space, but as embodied knowledge carried by specific people, traveling specific routes for specific reasons. A metallurgist relocated from Damascus to Beijing carried his techniques in his hands and his head. A weaver moved from Hangzhou to Tabriz brought her knowledge of silk working with her. A military engineer captured in one campaign and deployed in the next brought his understanding of siege warfare to a new context. The Mongol contribution to technology was, in a very real sense, a logistical achievement as much as an intellectual one. They built the infrastructure through which knowledge could travel, and then they actively moved knowledge through it. This is why the collapse of the Mongol Empire in the 14th century had such significant consequences for technological exchange. When the political unity fractured, the Yam system deteriorated. Trade routes became less safe. The systematic relocation of specialists slowed and stopped the network that had facilitated the most intensive period of Eurasian knowledge transfer in pre-modern history degraded and eventually disappeared. How some of the connections it had created persisted. You can't unteach a metallurgist a new technique, but the rate and scope of exchange diminished dramatically. What remained were the technologies themselves, now scattered across Eurasia in new configurations, embedded in local traditions that would continue to develop them in their own directions. Chinese gunpowder became European cannons. Persian astronomical knowledge informed Chinese star catalogs. Central Asian textile techniques transformed Italian silk weaving. The Mongol network had done its work, and the results would shape the technological landscape of the world for centuries to come, long after the empire that had made them possible had crumbled into its successor states. In Part 4, we're going to turn to the Mongol relationship with medicine and public health, which is a fascinating and deeply contradictory story. The same empire that brought the Black Death to Europe also maintained one of the most sophisticated medical establishments of the medieval world. The same rulers who slaughtered millions also invested heavily in hospitals, pharmacological research, and the cross-cultural exchange of medical knowledge. It's one of the strangest chapters in the history of medicine, and it deserves careful attention. Hashtag Part 4. Medicine, Disease, and the Contradictions of Imperial Health. The Mongol Empire's relationship with medicine is perhaps the most deeply paradoxical chapter in its entire history of technological and scientific engagement. Here was an empire that facilitated the deadliest pandemic in human history, the Black Death, which killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Eurasia in the 14th century. And here was that same empire maintaining sophisticated hospitals, sponsoring the translation of medical texts across linguistic boundaries, employing physicians from every major medical tradition in the known world, and actively promoting cross-cultural pharmacological research. The contradiction is not superficial. It runs to the very core of what the Mongol Empire was, a system that connected the world in ways that were simultaneously creative and catastrophic, that opened channels through which knowledge and plague traveled with equal efficiency. To understand how this worked, we need to start with what the Mongols brought to the table medically before they ever began conquering settled civilizations. Or steppe medicine was not primitive, though it was certainly different from the traditions practiced in Chinese, Islamic, or European medical establishments. The Mongols had a sophisticated understanding of trauma surgery, which makes perfect sense when you consider that they were a warrior society in which arrow wounds, broken bones, and blade injuries were routine occupational hazards. They practiced wound irrigation, used felt and leather as bandaging materials, and had developed techniques for extracting arrowheads that European surgeons would not match for centuries. They understood the importance of keeping wounds clean, even if their theoretical framework for why cleanliness mattered was shamanistic rather than bacteriological. Mongol field medicine was, in many respects, superior to its European equivalent. And this was not accidental. It was the product of a culture in which warfare was central, and the practical treatment of war injuries was a matter of survival. They also had a tradition of herbal medicine rooted in the plants available on the steppe, knowledge of bone setting that was remarkably advanced, and practices around diet and hygiene that reflected their pastoral lifestyle. Fermented mare's milk, arag, was understood to have restorative properties, and while the Mongols would not have described this in terms of probiotics, they were not wrong about its health benefits. Their shamanistic healers combined practical treatments with ritual elements in ways that modern observers sometimes find difficult to parse. But the practical component was real and often effective. What changed everything was conquest. As the Mongol Empire expanded to encompass China, Persia, Central Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe, the Mongol rulers suddenly had access to the three most sophisticated medical traditions in the medieval world: Chinese medicine, Islamic medicine, and to a lesser extent, the medical traditions of India and Tibet. And unlike many conquerors, the Mongol Khans were genuinely interested in what these traditions had to offer. This was partly pragmatic. The Khans wanted to live long lives, and they were willing to employ any physician from any tradition who might help them do so. But it was also part of a broader Mongol approach to knowledge that was remarkably non-chauvinistic. The Mongols did not assume that their own traditions were necessarily superior. They were empiricists in the most basic sense. They wanted to know what worked, and they were willing to test ideas from any source. The result was something genuinely unprecedented in the history of medicine: a sustained, state-sponsored effort to bring together physicians from radically different medical traditions and have them learn from one another. At the court of Kublai Khan in China, you could find Chinese physicians trained in the classical traditions of the Huangdi Nejing, Islamic physicians schooled in the Galenic Avicennan tradition, Tibetan doctors practicing their own distinctive synthesis of Indian and indigenous medical knowledge, and Mongol shamanic healers all operating in proximity to one another. This was not merely coexistence. There is documentary evidence that these practitioners actively exchanged ideas, that Chinese pulse diagnosis techniques were studied by Islamic physicians, that Islamic pharmacological knowledge was incorporated into Chinese medical practice, and that Tibetan medical concepts influenced both. The institutional expression of this cross-cultural medical exchange was remarkable. In Yuan Dynasty, China, Kublai Khan established the Imperial Academy of Medicine, which was divided into departments that explicitly represented different medical traditions. There was a department for Chinese medicine, a department for Islamic medicine, and departments for other traditions as well. The fact that these were organized as parallel departments within a single institution rather than as competing or hierarchically ranked systems tells us something important about the Mongol approach. They were not trying to declare one tradition superior and eliminate the others. They were trying to draw on all of them simultaneously. The Islamic medical tradition was particularly influential in Yuan China, and the vector of this influence is well documented. A text known as the Hui Yao Fang, the Muslim pharmaceutical formulary, was compiled during the Yuan Dynasty and represents one of the most significant examples of medical knowledge transfer in the medieval world. This text translated Islamic pharmacological knowledge into Chinese, making hundreds of drug formulations from the Islamic medical tradition available to Chinese practitioners. Some of these were based on ingredients that were already known in China but used differently. Others introduced entirely new substances into Chinese pharmacological practice. The text also included surgical techniques from the Islamic tradition, dietary recommendations, and theoretical frameworks that, while different from Chinese medical theory, were presented as complementary rather than contradictory. The flow of knowledge went in both directions. Chinese medical techniques, particularly acupuncture and moxibustion, attracted the attention of Islamic physicians working within the Mongol domains. While acupuncture did not become widely adopted in the Islamic medical world during this period, there is evidence of scholarly interest and some experimental adoption. More significantly, Chinese pharmacological knowledge, including the use of numerous plant, animal, and mineral substances, was transmitted westward through Mongol commercial and diplomatic networks. Rashid al-Din, the great Persian historian and vizier of the Ilkhanate, compiled a work on Chinese medicine called the Tansuknama, which translated Chinese medical and pharmacological knowledge into Persian. This was an extraordinary intellectual achievement, requiring not just linguistic competence, but a deep enough understanding of both medical traditions to make meaningful translations between fundamentally different theoretical frameworks. The Mongols also invested in public health infrastructure in ways that reflected their practical orientation. Hospitals were established and maintained in the major cities of the empire. In Yuan China, these institutions served populations that had been devastated by decades of warfare, and they represented a genuine effort by the Mongol administration to restore some measure of public welfare. The motivations were not purely altruistic, of course. A healthy population was a productive and taxable population. And the Mongol rulers understood this calculation perfectly well. But the result was nonetheless a medical infrastructure that served millions of people and that drew on multiple medical traditions in doing so. Tibetan medicine deserves special mention in this story because the Mongol relationship with Tibet was uniquely close. The Mongol Khans, particularly those of the Yuan Dynasty, developed a deep engagement with Tibetan Buddhism, and this religious connection brought with it a medical dimension. Tibetan medicine, known as Sowa Rigpa, was a sophisticated system that had synthesized Indian Ayurvedic traditions with indigenous Tibetan practices and with Chinese medical influences. The Tibetan medical text known as the Gyushi, the Four Tantras, represented a comprehensive medical system that addressed everything from pharmacology to surgery to psychiatric conditions. Through the Mongol-Tibetan religious and political relationship, this medical tradition gained broader exposure and influence, and Tibetan physicians became important figures at the Mongol court. Now, we need to confront the dark side of this story because it is inescapable and it is enormous. The same Mongol network that transmitted medical knowledge across Eurasia also transmitted the bacterium Yersinia pestis, the causative agent of plague. The Black Death, which reached Europe in 1347 and proceeded to kill roughly a third of the continent's population, traveled along the very trade routes that the Mongol Empire had created and maintained. The standard narrative places the origin of this pandemic in Central Asia, possibly in the region around Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, where cemetery inscriptions from the 1330s record an unusual spike in deaths attributed to pestilence. From there, the plague moved along Mongol trade routes to the Black Sea port of Kaffa, where, according to a famous account by the notary Gabriele de Mussis, the Mongol army besieging the city catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, an early and horrifying example of biological warfare. Whether or not the catapult story is entirely accurate, and historians debate its details, the broader epidemiological picture is clear. The Mongol Empire's vast commercial network, which facilitated the movement of goods, ideas, and people across the breadth of Eurasia, as it also facilitated the movement of disease vectors. The marmots and rats that carried plague-bearing fleas traveled in grain shipments and trade caravans. The humans who carried the pneumonic form of plague traveled the same roads as the merchants and diplomats. The Pax Mongolica, which had made long-distance trade safer and more efficient than it had ever been before, had also created the perfect conditions for a pandemic. The speed and reach of the Mongol network meant that a disease that might previously have remained a localized outbreak could become a continental catastrophe. The death toll was staggering. China's population may have dropped from approximately 120 million to around 65 million during the period of Mongol rule. The warfare and famine were significant contributors alongside disease. The Islamic world was devastated. Egypt, Syria, Iraq, and Persia all suffered enormous losses. And Europe, of course, experienced the most well-documented impact, with mortality rates that transformed the continent's social, economic, and cultural landscape in ways that are still being studied and debated. The irony here is savage. The same empire that was bringing Chinese and Islamic physicians together, that was sponsoring the translation of medical texts, that was investing in hospitals and pharmacological research, was simultaneously creating the conditions for the worst epidemic disaster in human history. And the medical establishments of all these traditions were essentially powerless against plague. Chinese physicians, Islamic physicians, European physicians, Tibetan physicians, none of them understood what was causing the disease. None of them had effective treatments, and none of them could stop its spread. The cross-cultural medical exchange that the Mongol Empire had fostered produced many valuable results, but it did not and could not produce an understanding of infectious disease that would have been necessary to prevent or contain a pandemic. That understanding would not come for another 500 years. There is another dimension to the Mongol relationship with disease that deserves attention, and that is the role of earlier epidemics during the initial conquests themselves. When the Mongol armies swept through settled civilizations, they brought disruption that created the conditions for disease outbreaks, even when they did not directly introduce new pathogens. The destruction of irrigation systems, the displacement of populations, the concentration of refugees in overcrowded conditions, the disruption of food supplies, all of these consequences of Mongol warfare created epidemiological crises that compounded the direct death toll from military action. In some cases, the disease toll from these secondary effects may have exceeded the toll from combat itself. This was not unique to the Mongols. It is a pattern that accompanies virtually all large-scale warfare in pre-modern societies. But the scale of Mongol conquest meant that the scale of these epidemiological consequences was proportionally enormous. What makes the Mongol medical story genuinely interesting, beyond its catastrophic dimensions, is the question of legacy. The cross-cultural medical exchanges that occurred under Mongol rule did leave lasting traces. The transmission of Islamic pharmacological knowledge to China enriched the Chinese pharmaceutical tradition in ways that persisted long after the Yuan Dynasty fell. The transmission of Chinese medical concepts westward contributed to a broadening of Islamic medical knowledge. The elevation of Tibetan medicine through the Mongol-Tibetan connection gave that tradition a prestige and institutional support that would sustain it for centuries. And the very idea that medical knowledge could and should be gathered from diverse traditions and synthesized into something greater than any single component, this idea, while not unique to the Mongol period, received powerful reinforcement from the Mongol experience. The Mongol approach to medicine also reflected something broader about their approach to knowledge in general, which was fundamentally pragmatic and non-dogmatic. The Mongol Khans did not care whether a treatment came from a Chinese, Islamic, Tibetan, or shamanic tradition. They cared whether it worked. This pragmatism could be seen as shallow, as a mere consumer's approach to knowledge that lacked theoretical depth. But it also had a genuine virtue. It created space for experimentation, for the testing of ideas across cultural boundaries, for the possibility that one tradition might have something to teach another. In a medieval world that was often characterized by intellectual insularity and the assumption that one's own tradition held all the answers, the Mongol willingness to entertain alternatives was genuinely unusual. The pharmacological dimension of this exchange was particularly significant. Both the Chinese and Islamic medical traditions placed enormous emphasis on materia medica, on the identification, preparation, and application of medicinal substances. The Mongol commercial network meant that substances that had previously been available only locally could now be traded across the entire breadth of Eurasia. Herbs, minerals, and animal products that had been part of one tradition's pharmacopoeia became available to practitioners of other traditions. This expansion of the available pharmacological toolkit was one of the most concrete and lasting consequences of the Mongol period for medical practice. The story of Mongol medicine is, in the end, a story about the double-edged nature of connectivity. And connection makes possible the exchange of knowledge, the sharing of techniques, the cross-pollination of ideas. It also makes possible the transmission of disease, the spread of catastrophe, the amplification of destruction. The Mongol Empire embodied both of these possibilities simultaneously and to an extreme degree. It was the most connected political entity the world had yet seen, and the consequences of that connectivity were both immensely productive and immensely destructive. Medicine, perhaps more than any other domain of knowledge, illustrates this duality with painful clarity. The physicians who gathered at the Mongol courts, who translated each other's texts, who experimented with each other's techniques, were engaged in work that was genuinely valuable and that contributed to the long-term advancement of medical knowledge. As the plague that traveled along the same routes that brought those physicians together killed tens of millions of people and altered the demographic trajectory of 3 continents. Both of these things were products of the same system. Both were consequences of the same imperial project. The Mongol Empire did not choose one and reject the other. It produced both, simultaneously and inseparably, and history must reckon with both. In Part 5, we will conclude by examining the Mongol legacy in science, astronomy, and mathematics, the remarkable observatories they built and funded, and the broader question of how to assess the Mongol Empire's place in the history of human knowledge. The answer, as we shall see, is as complicated as everything else about this extraordinary and terrible empire. In Part 5, the stars sit above the ruins. The observatory at Marageh, in what is now northwestern Iran, was completed around 1259. It was one of the most sophisticated scientific installations in the medieval world. Its patron was Hulagu Khan, the Mongol conqueror who had sacked Baghdad the year before, destroying the Abbasid Caliphate, demolishing the House of Wisdom, and presiding over the massacre of hundreds of thousands of people. The man he appointed to direct the observatory was Nasir al-Din al-Tusi, one of the greatest mathematicians and astronomers of the medieval period, who had been effectively held captive by the Ismaili assassins at Alamut before the Mongol siege liberated him, or captured him. The distinction with the Mongols was frequently unclear. Al-Tusi had been working on astronomical problems for decades. At Marageh, with Hulagu's funding and the resources of a world empire behind him, he was able to build something unprecedented. The observatory complex included a library reportedly containing 400,000 volumes, many of them salvaged or looted from Baghdad and other conquered cities. It housed instruments of remarkable precision, including a mural quadrant with a radius of over 4 meters, armillary spheres, and astrolabes of sophisticated design. Al-Tusi assembled a team of astronomers drawn from across the Mongol domains and beyond, including scholars from China, from the Islamic world, and possibly from as far as Byzantium. The working language was primarily Arabic and Persian, but the intellectual traditions represented were genuinely diverse. The astronomical tables produced at Marageh, known as the Zij-e-il-Khani, represented a significant advance over previous compilations. They corrected errors in earlier observations, provided more accurate calculations of planetary positions, and introduced mathematical innovations that would have lasting consequences. Most significantly, Al-Tusi developed what is now called the Tusi couple, a mathematical device that resolved a long-standing problem in Ptolemaic astronomy. Ptolemy's model of planetary motion required a mechanism called the equiant, which violated the principle that celestial motion should be composed of uniform circular motions. The Tusi couple demonstrated that linear motion could be produced by the combination of two circular motions, providing a way to model planetary movement without the equiant while maintaining accuracy. At this mathematical innovation matters far beyond the history of Islamic astronomy. 2.5 centuries later, Nicholas Copernicus used a device functionally identical to the Tusi couple in his own astronomical work. The question of whether Copernicus had direct access to Al-Tusi's work or independently arrived at the same solution remains debated among historians of science. But the structural similarities are striking and suggestive. The pathways of transmission remain unclear, but the possibility that the Marageh Observatory's work influenced the Copernican revolution is taken seriously by serious scholars. If that influence is real, then the chain of causation runs through the Mongol Empire. Through Hulagu's patronage, through the sack of Baghdad, or through the assembly of scholars that Mongol conquest made possible and Mongol violence made necessary. This is the pattern we have encountered repeatedly throughout this series, and it is worth dwelling on one final time, because the observatory at Marageh embodies it with particular clarity. The books in its library came from cities that had been destroyed. The funding came from the plunder of civilizations. The scholars who worked there had been drawn together by forces that also scattered millions of others into exile, slavery, or death. The Tusi couple is a genuine intellectual achievement. The astronomical tables are genuinely important, and they were produced within an institution that was, in the most literal sense, built on ashes. The Marageh Observatory was not an anomaly. Under Hulagu's successors, the Ilkhanate continued to support astronomical work. The tradition culminated in another great observatory built at Samarkand in the early 15th century by Ulugh Beg, a Timurid ruler and descendant of the Mongol imperial tradition. Ulugh Beg's observatory produced a star catalogue of remarkable accuracy, some of whose measurements were not surpassed until the invention of the telescope. The Timurid scientific tradition was a direct continuation of the Mongol one, carried forward by successor states that inherited both the Mongol interest in practical knowledge and the Mongol willingness to fund large-scale institutional projects. In China, the pattern was similar. When Kublai Khan established the Yuan Dynasty, he inherited a sophisticated Chinese astronomical tradition and supplemented it with knowledge from the Islamic world. In 1267, the Persian astronomer Jamal al-Din arrived at Kublai's court, reportedly bringing with him 7 astronomical instruments of Islamic design, including a terrestrial globe, a celestial globe, and an armillary sphere, constructed according to principles unfamiliar to Chinese astronomers. Kublai subsequently commissioned the Chinese astronomer Guo Shoujing to reform the calendar, providing him with extensive resources to build observatories and instruments. Guo Shoujing's resulting work, the Shoshi calendar, adopted in 1281, was arguably the most accurate calendar produced anywhere in the world up to that date. It calculated the length of the tropical year to within 26 seconds of the modern value. It introduced innovations in spherical trigonometry and interpolation that were mathematically sophisticated by any standard. And it was produced within the institutional framework of the Yuan Dynasty, drawing on both Chinese and Islamic astronomical traditions in ways that would have been far less likely without the Mongol unification of Eurasia. The calendar's accuracy was not merely a theoretical achievement. It had practical consequences for agriculture, for ritual, for the administration of a vast empire. It represented the application of cross-cultural scientific knowledge to the governance of a conquered population. The broader pattern of Mongol engagement with mathematics and the sciences followed a consistent logic. The Mongols themselves, as a steppe society, had no significant pre-conquest tradition of formal mathematical or scientific inquiry. As what they had was a pragmatic orientation toward useful knowledge and a willingness to employ anyone who possessed it, regardless of cultural or religious background. This pragmatism was not tolerance in any modern sense. It was instrumentalism. Knowledge was valued to the extent that it served the empire's purposes, which included administration, taxation, military planning, and the legitimation of rule. Astronomy served all of these functions. Accurate calendars legitimated the ruler's mandate. Precise astronomical observations had astrological significance in the Mongol worldview. The ability to predict eclipses and planetary conjunctions was understood as evidence of cosmic understanding and, by extension, of the right to rule. This instrumental attitude shaped which kinds of knowledge the Mongols promoted and which they neglected. They were enthusiastic patrons of astronomy, mathematics, medicine, geography, cartography, and agricultural science, all of which had obvious practical applications. They were less consistently interested in philosophy, theology, or literary culture, except insofar as these served administrative or diplomatic purposes. The great philosophical traditions of the Islamic world and China continued under Mongol rule, but they continued largely despite Mongol indifference rather than because of Mongol support. The Mongol contribution to the history of ideas was not in generating new philosophical frameworks, but in creating the conditions under which existing traditions could interact. The cartographic achievements of the Mongol period deserve particular mention. The administration of a continental empire required maps, and the Mongols invested in their production. The most remarkable surviving example is the Kang-Nido map, produced in Korea in 1402, but drawing on Yuan Dynasty sources. It depicts the entire known world from Japan to Africa and Europe, with a level of geographic knowledge that reflects the information networks of the Mongol period. Africa appears in recognizable form, as does the Arabian Peninsula, India, and Europe, though all are somewhat distorted. The map is evidence of a genuinely global geographic consciousness that the Mongol Empire made possible, a consciousness that emerged from the movement of diplomats, merchants, missionaries, and soldiers across previously uncrossable boundaries. Similarly, Rashid al-Din's Jami al-Tawarikh, the compendium of chronicles commissioned by the Ilkhanid court in the early 14th century, represents perhaps the first attempt at a genuine world history. It covers not only the Mongols and the Islamic world, but also China, the Franks, and the Jews, drawing on informants and sources from across Eurasia. The ambition of the project, the idea that a single historical work could and should encompass the entire known world, was itself a product of the Mongol moment. It reflected an imperial perspective in which the whole world was, at least in principle, a single domain. These are genuine achievements, and they matter. The Maraghe Observatory, Guo Shoujing's calendar, the Kang-Nido map, the Jami al-Tawarikh. These represent real advances in human knowledge, real expansions of what people understood about the world they inhabited. They were produced by brilliant individuals working within institutions that the Mongol Empire created or sustained. To deny their significance would be as dishonest as to deny the significance of the destruction that accompanied them. But to celebrate them without acknowledging their context would be equally dishonest. And so, we arrive at the question that has haunted this entire series. The question of how to assess the Mongol Empire's place in the history of human knowledge. The temptation is to construct a balance sheet, to weigh the astronomical tables against the massacres, to ask whether the Silk Road trade was worth the plague, to calculate whether the cross-cultural exchanges justified the conquests that produced them. This temptation should be resisted, not because the question is unimportant, but because the framing is wrong. The Mongol Empire did not offer the world a bargain. It did not say, accept this many deaths, and in return you will receive this many scientific advances. The conquests and the knowledge were not exchanged for each other. They were produced by the same processes, driven by the same imperatives, inseparable in practice, even if distinguishable in analysis. The observatory at Maraghe exists because Baghdad was sacked, not metaphorically, literally. The books in its library were taken from Baghdad. The money that built it came from the conquest. The astronomer who ran it was freed from captivity by the same army that filled the Tigris with blood and ink. To say that the Mongol Empire was good for science is to make a statement that is true in a narrow sense and profoundly misleading in a broader one. It is true that certain scientific achievements occurred within the Mongol context that might not have occurred otherwise, or might have occurred later, or might have occurred differently. It is misleading because it implies a causal relationship that is far simpler than the reality. The Mongol Empire was not a research grant. It was a system of domination that, among its many consequences, created conditions under which certain kinds of knowledge production flourished. It also created conditions under which other kinds of knowledge production were destroyed. Libraries were burned, scholars were killed, entire intellectual traditions were disrupted or ended. The net effect on human knowledge is not calculable because we cannot know what the people who were killed might have discovered, or what the libraries that were burned might have contained, what the civilizations that were shattered might have produced. What we can say is this: the Mongol Empire demonstrated with terrible clarity that the production of knowledge and the production of suffering are not opposites. They are not on different sides of a moral ledger. They can be, and in this case were, products of the same system. The same imperial apparatus that brought astronomers together across civilizational boundaries also brought the plague. The same trade routes that carried mathematical ideas carried death. The same conquest that assembled unprecedented collections of books began by destroying unprecedented collections of books. This is not a comfortable conclusion. It does not lend itself to simple narratives of progress or simple narratives of decline. It does not allow us to categorize the Mongol Empire as either a force for enlightenment or a force for destruction. It was both, completely and simultaneously, and the bothness is the point. The history of human knowledge is not a story of steady advancement, occasionally interrupted by catastrophe. It is a story in which advancement and catastrophe are often inextricable, in which the conditions that produce discovery also produce devastation, in which the same roads carry silk and plague, ideas and armies, scholars and executioners. The Mongol Empire ended, as all empires do. By the mid-14th century, the unified empire that Genghis Khan had built and his successors had expanded was fragmenting into competing successor states. The Yuan Dynasty fell in 1368, replaced by the Ming. The Ilkhanate dissolved into competing polities. The Chagatai Khanate splintered. The Golden Horde weakened and eventually disintegrated. The specific political structures of the Mongol Empire proved impermanent, but the connections they had established, the knowledge they had moved, the demographic and ecological changes they had set in motion, these persisted. The world after the Mongol Empire was different from the world before it, more connected, more aware of its own extent, more knowledgeable in some domains, more impoverished in others, scarred in ways that would take centuries to heal, changed in ways that can never be undone. The technologies and discoveries we have examined across these 5 parts, gunpowder and printing, medical knowledge and agricultural techniques, astronomical observations and mathematical innovations, navigation and cartography, none of them were Mongol inventions. The Mongols invented very little. What they did was create an imperial system that moved existing knowledge across boundaries that had previously contained it, that forced traditions into contact that had previously developed in isolation, that assembled scholars and craftsmen and engineers from diverse civilizations and set them to work on problems defined by imperial need. The results were sometimes magnificent and sometimes catastrophic, and frequently both at once. This is, in the end, what makes the Mongol Empire so important to the history of technology and discovery, and so resistant to simple assessment. It was not a civilization in the way that Tang China, or Abbasid Baghdad, or Renaissance Florence were civilizations. It did not produce a distinctive artistic tradition, or a coherent philosophical system, or a lasting body of literature. What it produced was a system, a network, a set of conditions within which other civilizations' achievements could be recombined and redirected. It was a catalyst in the chemical sense. It accelerated reactions without being consumed by them, and the reactions it accelerated included both creation and destruction. The stars that Al-Tusi observed from Maragay were the same stars that shone over the ruins of Baghdad. The mathematics he used to track their movements was developed in the quiet of his study, funded by the proceeds of conquest, building on traditions preserved in books taken from cities that no longer existed as they had before. The calendar that Guo Shoujing perfected told time for an empire built on the bones of millions. The maps that Mongol-era cartographers drew depicted a world that the Mongols had made knowable by making it conquerable. These are not contradictions to be resolved. They are the reality of how human knowledge has advanced, and it is a reality that should make us neither comfortable nor complacent. The Mongol Empire gave the world a great deal. It took a great deal more. And the giving and the taking were the same act, performed by the same hands, along the same roads, under the same indifferent